we reached out.
Hi, everyone. I think we're going to get started. I just want to welcome you all here to the York County History Center. My name is Nicole Smith. We just have a couple of brief announcements about upcoming events here and programs here at the History Center, then we'll get started. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the History Center's YouTube channel. So if you Google York County History Center YouTube, it'll come right up for you. Let's see. Coming up let's start with our book blast. You may remember we always had a big book blast book sale. We're doing it again this year. Drop off is happening now. So if you have books, we are accepting them at the Agricultural and Industrial Museum Fridays and Saturdays through May. And then the sale itself is June 5th through 7th. Coming up on May 4th, I'm going backwards. May 1st through 2nd is our Give Local York fundraising event, all across nonprofits in York County. On Friday, we have free admission and activities here, as well as a demonstration of the organ, the Tannenberg organ, at 7 o'clock. This is recently reinstalled here in our new location just a couple weeks ago. 1804, so it's very fun, old organ. We will be having organ concerts later this summer, so please stay tuned. On May the 4th, we have a World War II briefings program. Speakers are Richard Robinson, Tina Charles, and a World War II veteran, Frank Cohn. On that same day, the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogy Society is sponsoring a trip to the Adams County Historical Society. Actually, it's not really a trip, it's meet there. There'll be a tour and they'll be showing the research library as well. And finally, on May 10th, our second Saturday speaker is Mike Maloney, who wrote a recent book called Rattlesnake Colonel, Thomas Cressup, and American Paradox. He'll be speaking on that Saturday. Thank you very much. Our website is yorkhistorycenter.org. Please take a look for upcoming events. Thank you. Now I'm going to turn it over to Scott Rosenau.
Thank you, Nicole. And once again, we're thankful for the History Center for this great facility that we've been using for almost a year now. It's a very nice facility, and we're thankful to be using this. I just want to thank everyone who has come this evening and those who will be watching later on for this meeting. Before we start tonight's program, I do want to give you a preview of next month. Next month, we're going to welcome local historian and Roundtable favorite. He speaks here almost every year. Jim McClure. He's going to be talking about his book, Never to Be Forgotten. And he's going to be focusing on how the American Revolution intersected with the Civil War in York County, because both those wars did cross York County at different points. He's going to talk about how soldiers in the Revolution and the Civil War marched across York soil, something that few regions north of the Mason-Dixon line can point to. So what are the local connections between the two wars, separated by about 85 years? Jim McClure will talk about links between the two significant wars in two different centuries at today's meeting of the Roundtable. The topic with relevancy on the eve of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and Articles of Confederation. Jim McClure is a retired editor of the York Daily Record and Sunday News. After serving some leadership positions at the news organization for more than 30 years. In that time, he also served as USA Today Network's state editor for Pennsylvania, Delaware, and Maryland. He oversaw 6 daily newsrooms, and he served as East Region editor for Digital First Media with oversight of 24 daily newsrooms. He's senior on-site editor for coverage of Sandy Hook Elementary Massacre in Newtown, Connecticut, and Boston Marathon bombing. He's the author of 10 books on York County history, including the one I just showed you, Never to Be Forgotten. And His works cover the American Revolution, Civil War, World War II. And in 2025, he was inducted into the Pennsylvania News Media Association Hall of Fame. And he also partners with Jamie Norkel and Dominish Miller on YouTube series Hometown History. Tonight, we welcome back Codie Eash. He's spoken to our group a few times, and we definitely look forward to this program once again. He serves as the Director of Education and Interpretation at the Seminary Bridge Museum Education Center in Gettysburg. He earned his undergraduate degree in communication journalism at Shippensburg University and began working on his master's in American history at Gettysburg College in 2024. And he told me that the topic of tonight's discussion is possibly linked to his master's thesis. He also lectures for American Battlefield Trust conferences, National Park Service sites, civil roundtables such as this one, libraries, and other community organizations. He's a founding contributor to Pennsylvania in the Civil War, writes book reviews for Civil War Monitor and articles for the Standard, and serves as a member of the Gettysburg Magazine editorial board. So let's welcome back Codie as he gives an interesting discussion of Lincoln and the sanitary fairs in 1864.
Thank you very much, Scott. Thanks to the Roundtable. Thanks to the History Center for having me. It's always a joy to speak in York, to have colleagues, friends, family members here in the audience, and to join all of you this evening. When Kathy had invited me to return, one of the things we had discussed in terms of what a fitting topic would be for this evening is to consider the events that were playing out not 161 years ago that we'll be speaking about this evening, but what is happening 160 years ago right now in the United States on April 16th, as it were, 1865. The nation would have just been going through the final week of the effective conclusion of the American Civil War, of Robert E. Lee's surrender to Ulysses S. Grant, of the days that followed that, the national celebrations, the preparation for the Reconstruction that would follow the war as the final Confederate armies are in the fields getting ready to surrender in the weeks that follow. But of course, there's going to be this gigantic thunderclap that smacks against that celebration that's going through the North, through the loyal United States. And that's going to be the assassination of Abraham Lincoln on April 14th and his death on April 15th, 160 years ago yesterday. And so I thought it would be fitting, before we really dive into the meat of our topic this evening, to just consider what is life like in York. If you were opening your paper, weekly papers as it is at that point in time, in this case on April 18th, the York Democrat. Just want to quote from it to give us a sense of what would have been happening on these streets here in those first couple of weeks of April 1865. Bear in mind, no news has been printed since April 11th. Just 2 days after the surrender of Lee. And so in your first column, you have this story. In York, the people could not restrain their feelings. Men without distinction of party met together on the streets. Old prejudices were laid aside. Personal feuds were healed. And the victory, the great and glorious victory, the country redeemed and slavery annihilated, was the theme of general conversation. Talks about how there was music, iron tongues and cupolas of different churches, bells and the engine houses chimed in the chorus. The drums rolled at the hospital, the band turned out and discoursed its strains of victory and rejoicing. Universal joy pervaded our borough, and every man felt and spoke as though the end was here. The end of what? The end of a brutal and sanguinary war. The unprovoked and irrational in all its details, a war which for infamy has no parallel in history. So that's the first column, the celebration, the end of war. Celebration going through the streets of York, just as it is across towns throughout the entire loyal North. But then if you move over a couple of columns, there's a brief excerpt, more to follow in the weeks that followed. But this is what the York Democrat was able to report that day. On Saturday last, after the receipts of the death of the news of President Lincoln, all business in our borough was suspended. The stores closed and flags floating in different places, put at half-mast and draped in mourning. The town wore a sad and solemn aspect. The bells in all our churches were tolled, and everyone felt as though a great and terrible calamity had befallen the country. And so we have those church bells tolling in back-to-back weeks, but for completely different reasons. That celebration, people embracing as they're cheering, now turns to people embracing and mourning, consoling one another. There's also in that same column, quite coincidentally, and I never knew this until I was looking through this, a special visitor is in Gettysburg, is in York that week as well, under the headline General Garfield, the distinguished and uncompromising Union man of Ohio. He spent Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday of last week in our borough and was touring the town with a former representative of the Buchanan administration. And of course, the coincidence there, the irony there, is that Garfield is visiting the week that Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, and not quite 2 decades later, Garfield will be the second president assassinated in American history. So I thought that was just an appropriate place for us to kind of put our minds as far as what is happening on this consequential week of this 160th anniversary of the end of the war and the assassination of Lincoln. Now, of course, I'm visiting you all this evening from my day job at Seminary Ridge Museum and Education Center. I won't go into the full explanation of what the museum is. I know many in this audience have heard me talk about that before and are familiar with the work that we do on the historic campus of United Lutheran Seminary in a building that has stood since 1832, where we discuss the stories of the first day of the battle, medical care in one of the battlefield's most significant military hospitals, and the intersection of race and religion, debates over slavery and sectionalism that played out across the country and within these historic walls of Schmucker Hall. If anybody would like more information on the museum, I have a bunch of literature up here on the table, a sign-up sheet as well if you're interested in more information for our education or our general e-newsletters. And I'll also have at the end of our time on my final slide when we take questions in a bit, some information on a couple of upcoming events that we have. Now, as far as our topic this evening, this topic of Abraham Lincoln at sanitary fairs in 1864, oftentimes what happens is when I go talk about this with someone, and Scott and I just had this conversation a moment ago before we began this evening, is that people will be somewhat generally familiar with some pieces of these speeches. Even for those of you who don't think you are, there might be a quote or two throughout this evening that you will realize you have heard at some point in time and just never knew where it came from, but it comes from one of these Lincoln speeches. But it's in rare company in that the 3 speeches that Lincoln gives at sanitary fairs in the spring and summer of 1864, they don't receive any special treatment. We have books that are dedicated to Lincoln's antebellum career. Lincoln at Peoria by Louis Lehrman, for instance, takes a look at a speech in the 1850s that really brings Lincoln out of the state spotlight in Illinois and puts him on something of a national stage. We have then what Harold Holzer calls the speech that made Abraham Lincoln president, Lincoln at Cooper Union, this famous speech in 1860 that puts Lincoln on the fast track for the Republican nomination for the presidency. We have at the end of Lincoln's presidency, Ronald White looking at what he calls Lincoln's greatest speech, the second inaugural. And we have Lewis Mazur's Lincoln's last speech, looking at an oration that Lincoln delivered 160 years ago last week on April 11th, 1865, a speech in which Lincoln is looking ahead at his temporary plans for Reconstruction as the nation is coming out of civil war. So we have these 4 examples of books that are several times longer than any of those speeches were, delving into every piece as far as how Lincoln is piecing these speeches together, what his inspirations are, setting up some context for when they're delivered and the topics about which he is talking. And of course, we have scores of books, articles, essays, other forms of media that are dedicated just to the 272 words of the Gettysburg Address. For examples here, Gary Wills's received a Pulitzer Prize in the early 1990s. Gabor Borett's much beloved The Gettysburg Gospel. It's a more sort of personal take of what life is like in Gettysburg in the months after the battle as Lincoln is preparing to come and the ultimate dedication of the National Cemetery. My personal favorite, Writing the Gettysburg Address by Martin P. Johnson, published in 2013, gives us sort of a more modern take on Lincoln's inspiration for what we now know as perhaps the most famous speech in American history. And Sean Conant's simply titled The Gettysburg Address as a series of essays. But these join several more that take a look at that most famous speech. But these speeches we're looking at this evening, they have not receive this treatment. And throughout, I'll give a few reasons as to why I think that is, in part because of the timing of when they're delivered. They are just easily overlooked by bigger issues of the war. The fact that Lincoln is speaking on behalf of a predominantly women's-led organization, I think cannot be discounted as far as why they just are sort of swept under the rug, not put up there with the upper echelon of other Lincoln orations, and some other things that we'll talk about as we go forward. But what we'll see is that, as is the case throughout American history and really throughout human history, is that history is not all about words, it's not all about speeches, but words do certainly matter. And presidential rhetoric, when used effectively, can impact policy, can break news to the country that can be hard to hear, but can be delivered in a sympathetic, understanding, forthright manner. And I think that that's what Lincoln does throughout the course of these three addresses, because he's touching on some hard-hitting topics. And I would argue he's really taking the themes of some of his most famous speeches, like the Gettysburg Address, and he's far more militant than we typically see Lincoln at almost any other point, talking upfront about matters of race and racism, talking about racial atrocities against Black soldiers, and really more than anything, trying to encourage the American people to continue on, pressing on in this war, as the title suggests, even if it takes 3 years more. For starters, though, let's take a look at who he's speaking on behalf of. What is a sanitary fair and who is the United States Sanitary Commission? It's created in the summer of 1861, right after the war has begun. Lincoln is somewhat reluctant at first, as a book, an early book on the organization is called. He refers to it as the fifth wheel. And what he basically means by that is, what use is a fifth wheel on a four-wheeled cart? He thinks that this sort of public-private partnership is not really necessary, given the resources that are available from the federal government. But we can see as the war goes on, he and many others will develop this newfound appreciation for this organization and others like it, the Christian Commission among them, Patriot Daughters of Lancaster here locally in South Central Pennsylvania. We can see that there are these benevolent organizations, more often than not led by women, that are able to provide sanitary items, toiletries for soldiers, letter writing paper, personal care. Christian Commission distributes Bibles, hymn books, things that are lifting the spirits of soldiers. And we can see that there will develop this appreciation, especially among the soldiers, and especially in the aftermath of the war, as they're veterans and they're reflecting back upon the people who helped them. The Sanitary Commission is going to be one organization that comes to mind as a particularly helpful organization. There are more than 7,000 relief groups that are affiliated with the Sanitary Commission or associated with it by war's end across the loyal North, raising more than $15 million altogether through the United States for the United States war effort. For comparison, that's nearly $300 million today that it is going to raise. As I mentioned, it's predominantly women-led, but there will be a cohort of men who are going to try to take credit or take power from the women who are in charge of this organization. We see this infighting oftentimes at Civil War hospitals as a microcosm that we can expand outward as well, where there's going to be this debate between male doctors and female nurses or aides. There's a Catholic versus Protestant angle here that we sometimes see play out as a matter of debate as well. And we sometimes will see that there are these sort of authoritative figures who are involved in organizations who don't always play nicely with local civilians who are just trying to come and help at a hospital, whether it's in Frederick or Gettysburg or anywhere across the loyal North. In the fall of 1863, we're going to see for the first time, one of its main fundraising endeavors is to host a fair. And the first one occurs at Chicago in the fall of 1863. And its purposes are questioned. There are going to be accusations at many of these fairs that there's a misuse of funds, or just a questioning overall of why they're raising so much money. What is this money being used for? But generally speaking, as we go through the course of the war, it will become obvious that the amount of items that are given to soldiers in camp, in hospital, on the front line, especially when we get to the aftermath of Gettysburg and into 1864, when these armies are hunkered down on the outskirts of Richmond, at Petersburg, Virginia, we're going to see the value of these organizations will only increase in the eyes of those who desperately need it. Locally, in the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, we can see that a couple of locations at which the Sanitary Commission sets up its headquarters are photographed, and as we'll see in a moment, drawn sometime between July 7th and 9th, a building that still stands, Bonstock building here along Baltimore Street. That is the temporary home of the Sanitary Commission. If you zoom way into that image from the Library of Congress, there's a sign in the front of it denoting as such. And likewise here, around August 1863, there's a sign above this tent that says U.S. Sanitary Commission. And this would be out at Camp Letterman on this side of Gettysburg, right along Route 30, along the historic York Pike. And so we can see how present they are upon battlefields. A couple of images here from the following winter of 1864 that appear in Harper's Weekly of again, these tents, and in this case, a hut here that is associated with the Sanitary Commission. So it's sort of a ubiquitous organization. It's everywhere as the war goes on. People on the home front are certainly going to be aware of it, and they're attending these fairs at unseen levels, massive art displays, as we'll see, and they're going to come out in record numbers, many of these, including the ones that Lincoln attended. In the aftermath of Gettysburg, we see a couple of direct connections to some sanitary fairs. Rosina Hughley is pictured at the bottom left here. She oversaw the Patriot Daughters of Lancaster, our friends just to the east. And she'll write a pair of letters, you can see an excerpt of one here, to Lincoln, inviting him to a sanitary fair in Lancaster. That was supposed to take place in 1864. Her tone of her first letter is, "Mr. President, we would really appreciate it if you're able to come join us and speak." Lincoln doesn't respond, as far as I can tell. And then her second message is much more forthright. I don't know if you received my first message, but it's sort of unbecoming of a president to not want to reply to this organization that could really use his presence to raise money for our soldiers. Lincoln does not attend, as best I can tell. He does not reply either. Edward Everett, pictured at the bottom right side here, who is sort of that great piece of trivia of the Civil War, as far as the main speaker at the dedication of Soldiers National Cemetery, but who has a venerable career in his own right, a former vice presidential candidate, the president of Harvard, the governor of Massachusetts, the list goes on. And one of the copies of the Gettysburg Address that Lincoln creates after he delivers it is the Everett copy. And that copy is ultimately given to the Sanitary Fair in Philadelphia so that it could be sold to raise money. And so there's a direct connection we can make there. And we'll also see some civilians. In this case, this diary, the Diary of a Lady of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, published by civilian Sarah Broadhead in 1864. It's 1 month of her diary from June 15th to July 15th, 1863. The most famous pieces of which are her time at the Seminary Hospital treating patients there, but she sells copies of this, and all of the proceeds will go toward the benefit of the Sanitary Commission. And so this is something that would have surrounded people. And really, the Sanitary Commission, in many ways, is a forebear to a lot of both private organizations and sort of the basis of some government organizations that exist up into the 21st century. It's a forebear to things like the American Red Cross. There are aspects of it that we could see would be some of what FEMA does today. There are aspects of what USAID does. There are many of these public-private partnerships, this aid that is being provided, in this case, to a humanitarian crisis that is man-made. We can really see sort of the seeds are sown for many things that we are aware of in our own time. Now, to paint the picture, now that we have seen what this organization is, here's the timing of when Lincoln will give this series of speeches. From March 2nd to the 10th, 1864, we see in rapid succession a series of events play out that will bring Ulysses S. Grant east for the first time after being the victor throughout the Western theater of the American Civil War at Forts Henry and Donelson, at Shiloh, taking the city of Vicksburg in a siege that concludes the day after the Battle of Gettysburg is won, ultimately through the fall of 1863 and now into the winter of 1864. And Lincoln looks at Grant and he says, "That's my guy." And he'll bring Grant to Washington. And there's this famous story that plays out where Grant will go to the Willard Hotel with his son, and as he goes to check in, they say, "I'm sorry, there are no rooms available here except for one at the top floor," something along those lines. And he says, "That'll do for me." And as he signs his name in the ledger, the clerk sees that it says U.S. Grant and Son. And they say, "Why didn't you mention that you were General Grant? We of course have accommodations ready for you." And so this happens that week, for those who are familiar with that story. And he'll go to the White House, as we can see in the drawing here of Lincoln and Grant. And Grant will be made a lieutenant general of the United States Army, the first that anyone had held that distinction since George Washington at the beginning of the Republic. And so we'll see now U.S. Grant rising from this relatively hardscrabble, unknown, rising through the ranks general, the first year of the Civil War, to now commanding not just one army, but all U.S. armies here for the duration of the American Civil War. And we're going to see that Lincoln will have this get-together, this event that happens at the White House. And he says this of Grant, announcing for the first time that he is able to place his trust into a singular general that he thinks can lead the nation ultimately to victory. "The nation's appreciation of what you have done," says Lincoln, "and its reliance upon you for what remains to do in the existing great struggle are now presented with this commission. With this honor devolves upon you also a responsibility. As the country herein trusts you, so under God it will sustain you. I scarcely need to add that with which I here speak for the nation goes my own hearty personal concurrence." And so we're going to see this is step number one, to understanding why Lincoln says what he says at a series of sanitary fairs, is going to be that U.S. Grant is now in command of all the Republic's armies, and Lincoln sees that there is hope for ultimate Union victory. So our first sanitary fair that Lincoln attends is in Washington on March 18th, 1864. He's here for the final night of the Washington Sanitary Fair. It's at the Patent Office, which is the modern site of the Smithsonian American Art Museum. You see the picture of the great hall here inside, and this is the massive building from the outside. And the Washington Evening Star, I'll allow it to explain what happens the next day, in the paper of the next day. This is what it says of March 18th. "The hall was jammed with people on the occasion of the closing of the Grand Patriotic Fair, and an enthusiastic welcome was given to a general as he hobbled through the room on his crutches, advanced to the stand, and steadying himself by the crutches and the table," so he's leaning against the table, is this general, "proceeded to say, 'It is a noble work you are engaged in, honor given to the families of our brave soldiers while fighting our battles,' goes on to hail the work of the Sanitary Commission, the sanitary fairs, and the chief magistrate of the nation in reference to Lincoln. Any guesses as to who this general who needs to hobble across the room on crutches might be? Dan Sickles. Dan Sickles, the much lamented Third Corps commander at the Battle of Gettysburg, who lost a leg near the Trussell Farm in the battle's second day. The first eyewitness participant in the Battle of Gettysburg who Lincoln spoke to in the aftermath of the battle. A controversial figure then, and of course still even to this day. But he is the man who was introducing President Lincoln at this final night of the Washington Sanitary Fair. Lincoln's address appears to be off the cuff as best I can tell. It does not seem as though he arrived with any prepared remarks, and it's a rather short speech. He says this: "I appear to say but a word. This extraordinary war in which we are engaged falls heavily upon all classes of people, but most heavily upon the soldier. For it has been said, all that a man hath will he give for his life. And while all contribute of their substance, the soldier puts his life at stake and often yields it up to his country's cause. The highest merit then is due to the soldier. In this extraordinary war, extraordinary developments have manifested themselves, such as have not been seen in former wars. And amongst these manifestations, nothing has been more remarkable than these fairs for the relief of suffering soldiers and their families." So Lincoln thus far has made two major points. One, we have to remember everything we do for the soldier. We have to make sure that we give proper credit where credit is due to these men who are fighting on behalf of the Republic. And secondly, we have to remember their families. This is a theme that would become rather prevalent for Lincoln in the year that follows, his second inaugural address, for instance. He talks about caring not just for the for the soldier, but for the widow and the orphan. This is a theme he's starting really here. And the chief agents in these fairs, Lincoln continues, are the women of America. I am not accustomed to the use of language of eulogy. I have never studied the art of paying compliments to women, but I must say that if all that has been said by orators and poets since the creation of the world in praise of women were applied to the women of America, it would not do them justice for their conduct during this war. I will close by saying, God bless the women of America. And this is continuing on a theme that had really begun at Gettysburg. Edward Everett, we don't always remember what he said in that 2-hour oration, but a major theme of his was paying credit to the women of Gettysburg, to the women of America, soldiers, wives and widows, but also all these civilian nurses. And Lincoln, according to more than one account, in the aftermath of hearing that, apparently openly cried on the stand, the speaker's stand, moments before he gave the Gettysburg Address. And there's a story that appears in Lincoln's collected works of a group of people who are visiting Lincoln in the White House. Edward Everett comes up in conversation and he encourages this group of individuals to go read Edward Everett's Gettysburg Address, the one that he delivered before me, and especially read what he says about women. So that was something that really stuck with Lincoln. And really we can see this pivot made by the spring of 1864. This organization that he once derisively, sarcastically called a fifth wheel is now suddenly something that he's saying we have to pay just as much honor to the women who are leading this organization as we do to the soldiers in the field. This fair, just to give you a sense of how successful these are at an individual basis, the Liberator, the famous abolitionist newspaper, will publish a week later. The Sanitary fairs recently held at Chicago, Boston, Albany, Brooklyn, Cleveland, Buffalo, and including Washington, have realized $1.2 million, which would be more than $19 million when adjusted for inflation today. So in a brief span, they're getting scores of millions of dollars raised from these. Something else that's happening at this time, in between Sanitary fairs, before Lincoln goes to Baltimore next. I won't go into much detail on this, but it's an undercurrent behind the scenes. And it's that there are a lot of conversations taking place over what do we do about prisoners of war and how much amnesty do we give them, especially as Lincoln is starting to think the war might be drawing to a close. Now that's all relative. There's another year to go. But as early as December 1863, Lincoln had issued a proclamation on amnesty and Reconstruction, the basis of which was we will welcome all former Confederates back to the Union if they take a loyalty oath, but anybody who was in the Confederate military above the rank of colonel in the Army is subject to a potential treason trial. Anybody who left the United States government to become an officer in the Confederate military or served in the Confederate Congress or administration will be subject to a potential treason trial. And Lincoln says in that and several pieces that follow, including these, all property would be returned to former Confederates except one thing, and that's slaves. Slavery is done, Lincoln says. And so we're starting to see the wheels are turning more and more. These questions, these big questions. How do we treat former prisoners of war? How harsh do we become? Of course, this is all set against the backdrop of places like Andersonville and Libby Prison and Johnson's Island that are just overflowing with these prisoners on both sides after the prisoner exchange program had broken down nearly a year earlier. We'll talk a bit more about why that is. But that's an important thing. Lincoln is writing these proclamations. He's thinking about these questions. He's discussing all of this with his cabinet officials as he's delivering these great pieces of rhetoric and oratory at these Sanitary fairs. So now what we're going to see is that on April 13th, this is an invitation. I don't expect you to be able to read it there, but it's an invitation to the Baltimore Sanitary Fair, which is a bigger affair as far as Lincoln's presence especially than was the Washington Fair. And Lincoln will accept and he'll immediately get to work developing a speech. Here's the front of his one of his invitations. He's invited by several people. This one here came through Stella Colfax, who was Lincoln's Secretary of the Treasury, eventual Chief Justice to the U.S. Supreme Court. But if you look through the Library of Congress digital archives, there are many of these where everybody wanted Lincoln to come to this Baltimore Fair. And it was as though he had sort of broken the glass of attending the Washington Fair that now these people who run these fairs are seeing that the president will come, he will speak, he'll take this opportunity if you invite him. So everybody starts to invite him. And Lincoln gets to work on a draft. This is the what we know exists of his draft. Ultimately, it's not at all what he says, which is really interesting. He went in a totally different direction in the final version. This one is really heavy on the character of Daniel Webster, the great American statesman. In the great coat Lincoln was wearing the night he was assassinated at Ford's Theater. I had the chance to see this in 2015 for the 150th anniversary. But in the great coat, Lincoln had a Brooks Brothers coat that was embroidered with an eagle and the phrase "One country, one destiny," which came from a Daniel Webster speech: "One country, one constitution, one destiny." And it was also Daniel Webster's address at the dedication of the Bunker Hill Monument for the 50th anniversary of that battle of the American Revolution that many historians agree was the primary basis for what Lincoln said at Gettysburg. And so Daniel Webster is that looming figure over much of the 19th century and over Lincoln as well. And he hits a lot of Daniel Webster in this draft. The other thing he does in this draft that it was wise of him to not proceed with was he totally pans the city of Baltimore, where he's about to speak. He says this in part in the draft. On the 22nd or 23rd of February, 1861, which would have been when he was making his way to Washington, I passed through Baltimore, rich with honorable and fat offices, soon to be dispensed, and not one hand reached forth to greet me, not one voice broke the stillness to cheer me. Now, 3 years having passed, and offices having passed away, Baltimore marks my coming and cheers me when I come. And this is the story that Lincoln, so on the next slide, that Lincoln, when he had gone through Baltimore in 1861, he'll have to skirt past an assassination plot. And so that's going to be something that a lot of people pan Lincoln with, is that he has to basically sneak through the city of Baltimore when he had initially gone to Washington to assume the presidency in 1861. So whoever is advising with Lincoln, whether it's William Seward, his Secretary of State, or John Hay and John Nicolay, his private secretaries, it was wise of them, or of Lincoln himself, to avoid saying what he wanted to actually say about Baltimore. But the Baltimore Fair will last from April 18th to April 30th. We have this nice drawing of what one of these fairs look like. It's this massive festival-like atmosphere. Art is being sold and other wares. There are basically museum artifacts that are on display. And these are some of the largest collections of wares and art pieces and of these artifacts that had existed really up until the great fairs, the world's fairs of the decades that follow. So they were really quite spectacles. And this fair will raise nearly $1.6 million a day. Now, where this fair happens is at the Maryland Institute. Today is the Maryland Institute College of Arts is where it's located. We can see a period drawing of the building here. And Lincoln is going to open the fair on this occasion. So at Washington, he closes the fair with his remarks. In Baltimore, he is going to open. And he says this at the beginning. He strikes off this big picture theme of the necessity of change. Ladies and gentlemen, Lincoln opens, calling to mind that we are in Baltimore. We cannot fail to note that the world moves. Looking upon these many people assembled here to serve as they best may the soldiers of the Union. The nation is going through a period of change, says Lincoln. Yes, we've been engaged in this stalemate, this bloody war for 3 years, but things are changing. We're progressing, Lincoln feels. And then he'll make some allusions to what he had endured a few years earlier. Here's this derisive drawing of Lincoln sneaking through Baltimore in 1861, Pratt Street riots that had broken out, shedding blood for the first time in the first spring of the Civil War. Lincoln continues that theme of change. It occurs at once that 3 years ago, he says, the same soldiers could not so much as pass through Baltimore. Dangerous place for soldiers of the United States Army. The change from then till now is great and gratifying. Blessings on the brave men who have wrought the change and the fair women who strive to reward them for it. The change within Baltimore is part only of a far wider change. When the war began 3 years ago, neither party nor any man expected it would last till now. Each looked for the end in some way Neither did any anticipate that domestic slavery would be much affected by the war. Of course, Lincoln himself had progressed on this issue. It was 2 years earlier that he's telling Horace Greeley, the famous New York newspaper editor, that if I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. None of the slaves, I would do it. Some of the slaves, I would do it. Now Lincoln is fully on board. Emancipation is a war policy. And he's openly admitting to the people of Baltimore, I wouldn't have even thought that this was the case, but things change. But here we are, he says. The war has not ended, and slavery has been much affected. And then he gives one of his greatest lines of any piece of rhetoric, a piece of these speeches that I'm sure many of you have heard before. The world has never had a good definition of the word liberty, says Lincoln, and the American people just now are much in want of one. We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not mean the same thing. With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor. While with others, the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the product of other men's labor. Here are two, not only different, but incompatible things called by the same name, liberty. And it follows that each of these things is, by the respective parties, called by the shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, he gives one example, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd as a liberator, while the wolf denounces him for the same act as the destroyer of liberty. This is this homespun, Aesop's fables, biblical sort of illusion Lincoln is giving. In this case, the wolf would be the slave owner and the sheep would be the enslaved person. And he's saying that to the enslaved person, if you take away the enslaver, now you've given that person liberty. But to the enslaver, the government taking away their enslaved person, now they feel as though their liberty has been cast aside. And so as Lincoln concludes this section, he says, hence we behold the processes by which thousands are daily passing under the yoke of bondage, hailed by some as the advance of liberty, and bewailed by others as the destruction of liberty. I think it's a prescient point even to this day. We use similar terms, I mean, entirely different things by them. But this is how Lincoln's speech affects policy. He's moved beyond the abstract of change and liberty and where the nation is heading, and he breaks news to the American people. A painful rumor, he says, true, I fear, has reached us, of massacre by rebel forces at Fort Pillow in the west end of Tennessee on the Mississippi River, of some 300 colored soldiers and white officers who had just been overpowered by their assailants. Having determined to use the Negro as a soldier, there is no way but to give him all the protection given to any other soldier. Equal protection for soldiers serving the United States, Lincoln says. If there has been a massacre of 300 there, or even the 10th part of 300, and it can be conclusively proved, the retribution shall as surely come. It will be a matter of grave consideration in what exact course to apply the retribution, but in the supposed case it must come. Lincoln is breaking the news to the people of Baltimore of this massacre of 300 black soldiers and their white officers at Fort Pillow, famously, infamously, under the command of General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Newspapers passed from one to another, says one observer, and Confederates were not slow to realize what a propaganda weapon they had just handed their opponents. And Lincoln is going to jump right on that and say retribution is a possible fallout of this. And that's the first time that we're hearing an American president, and in this case Lincoln during the Civil War, say, not only will we capture enemies, not only will we take Confederate prisoners into our camps, but we may retaliate up to and including execution. And there's another piece of this speech that only appears in the newspaper version. It does not appear in Lincoln's portion, but it invokes the name Gettysburg up there. Thus then we cannot take a man who was captured at Gettysburg and make him suffer. So it's interesting to see how different newspapers are even spinning this their own way. It's not something Lincoln apparently said in this speech, but already they're gonna run with it. And this is a theme, this note of retaliation against Confederate soldiers for what they did at Fort Pillow. That even for non-abolitionist white soldiers, this will grab them. This will be something that soldiers left and right are writing letters home and saying that if this is true, if we find out that our Confederate opponents, that these rebels, that they have executed soldiers who are wearing the same blue uniform we are, and didn't just take them to prisoner of war camps, then we too, we would like a who would like a chance at those Confederate soldiers. And this becomes a major theme months that follow. And I don't want to delve too much into this, but just for a little context, if we take a step back to the previous summer, what we have here are from Jefferson Davis, May and July 1863, a couple of pieces of correspondence from the Confederate president, which talk about, in one instance, the Emancipation Proclamation being an attempt to emancipate slaves in the Confederate States, abduct slaves, incite insurrection, employ Negroes in the war against Confederate states, overthrow the institution of slavery, and bring on a servile war in these states. They see Lincoln's attempt at an Emancipation Proclamation as an attempt at inciting a slave insurrection. A lot of people compare him to John Brown, compare Lincoln to John Brown and what he had attempted to do. And so what Davis resolved that he is going to do is that every white person being a commissioned officer or acting as such, who during the present war shall command, arm, train, organize, or prepare, or voluntarily aid Negroes or mulattoes in any military enterprise, attack, or conflict, shall be deemed as inciting servile insurrection and shall be captured or put to death. So Jefferson Davis is saying, if you encounter Confederate soldiers, a black U.S. soldier on a battlefield or his white officer, capture him or put him to death immediately. This will lead Lincoln to issue what is oftentimes called the Order of Retaliation on July 30th, 1863. And it is the duty of every government to give protection to its citizens, he says, of whatever class, color, or condition, and especially to those who are duly organized as soldiers in the public service. And he goes on to say, it is therefore ordered that for every soldier of the United States killed in violation of the laws of war, a rebel soldier shall be executed. We see this language that is being placed, that this is no longer just a war between fellow countrymen. It's no longer just a war between states or sections of the nation. This is a war between belligerents who are out to execute their respective prisoners of war. And it all falls back to the issue of the Emancipation Proclamation, that black men could enlist in the United States armies now. And this is what had broken down the prisoner exchange program and why there's this overfilling of these prisons north and south. That just gives us a little bit of context there. Now, in the aftermath of the speech at Baltimore, where Lincoln had broken this news that Fort Pillow, as appeared to have happened, he goes to Congress. And Congress, in an incredibly efficient act, is going to immediately launch an investigation on April 21st, and on May 5th and 6th publishes its report. Just 2 weeks pass from the time to start the investigation to end the investigation. They interviewed dozens of soldiers who were at Fort Pillow, and they determined that this absolutely happened. And so Lincoln is going to go to his cabinet and ask them, what do you think we should do? And he received responses back. You can read them all online. They're all digitized by Library of Congress. And they basically range all the way from, just execute Confederate prisoners, all the way to the other end of the spectrum. We should probably do nothing. This would only be making it worse. But most cabinet officials, most members of Congress who speak on this, they land somewhere in between. Take it on a case-by-case basis. Do you execute the questions they're asking? Or do you execute one-to-one? Are several enlisted men worth more than one officer? Just as it would have been sometimes in the prisoner exchange program. Major issues of life and death, even outside of normal killing on a battlefield, that they're dealing with. And it all goes back to how Lincoln handled this when he spoke to the nation, spoke to the people of Baltimore in his Sanitary speech there. As that's all happening, we also have this major series of events in the war itself. Throughout the month of April, Lincoln and Grant are meeting, talking about the spring campaign. And we're going to see that in the days before what we now know as the Overland Campaign, the battles that begin at Wilderness, will go through Spotsylvania, North Anna River, Cold Harbor in the weeks that follow. Lincoln is going to set Grant off on this journey and feels as though he does not need to hold the hand of this general of all these armies now. On April 30th, Lincoln tells Grant, not expecting to see you again before the spring campaign opens, I wish to express my entire satisfaction with what you have done. So far as I understand it, the particulars of your plan I neither know nor seek to know. You are vigilant and self-reliant, and pleased with this, I wish not to obtrude any constraints or restraints upon you. And then he tells him, just please let me know what you're doing. And with a brave army and a just cause, may God sustain you. And we'll see Grant go forth on this series of battles that will be relentless, one after another, as Grant continues moving to his left and south, ultimately getting to the area around Petersburg, Virginia. We're going to see at this point in time as well that this important dispatch comes in. Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, is going to send this along through the ranks, and it will eventually get to Lincoln. And it's a message from Grant saying in part at the end there, I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer. And that's a line that will stick in Lincoln's craw, as we'll see it'll impact his next sanitary fair speech. As this is happening, we're going to see May 17th is a consequential day. We're going to see that there's a call for drafted soldiers. Lincoln's calling for 300,000 men in a new draft. We see the first drafts, of course, in U.S. history throughout the course of the Civil War. And we also see an order that Lincoln addresses to the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, but does not endorse and is never actually put into action. But it's a long piece of correspondence that makes it official that there is a retaliatory order at play, that you will execute Confederate prisoners of war if we find that they're executing our Black prisoners of war in U.S. armies. But ultimately, unlike here, we can see these are both in the collected works of Lincoln. This one's endorsed. This one, when it's found, does not have Lincoln's signature on it, was never made official. I would say a great what if of American history there. If that had happened, how differently might we view some of the reconciliationist language that will take shape in the years that follow? And as all of that is happening, now Lincoln starts to receive invitations to the last sanitary fair speech at which he will speak. And this one I chose to point out because it's rather remarkable for a couple of reasons. One, it's sent to him from the Great Central Fair. This is the fair that's in Philadelphia on June 16th, 1864, which is the day that Lincoln speaks. So he likely doesn't read the letter that's inside of this envelope. It simply probably wouldn't have gotten to him yet. But also we can see here, it refers to him as Father Abram, a loving term that a lot of people are using, especially African Americans, especially formerly enslaved people. And we can see that it's placed in the care of Uncle Sam. And this letter will say this: look here, Father Abram. They say you're father of the faithful, but I shan't believe it, unless you're faithful yourself. Don't you go and let old Sally Seward, that would be Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, tempt you to turn us out in the wilderness. Wilderness has a capital W. It's referring to the place, to the battle of the wilderness. Without a pass, nor drive us from your bosom to sleep our last sleep on yonder bloody pillow. Pillow is capitalized, a reference to Fort Pillow. Without even a rag of a flag to cover us. Haven't we served you well for many years as hewers of wood and drawers of water? Now I have been faithful, though I was only a bondwoman. It's a formerly enslaved woman who is sending this letter to President Lincoln, in which she has started by saying, don't leave us in the wilderness. Don't leave us in conditions like those that Black soldiers faced at Fort Pillow. Don't forget what this war is about. To be sure, you have given us bread and a bottle of water, but that won't save us from death or starvation in the wilderness. And I think you'll be mighty mean if you don't do something to save us from the beasts of the forest. And forest is spelled with a capital F and two R's, referring to Nathan Bedford Forest. You better look out, I can tell you, for if you don't treat us better, we'll take possession of the land of Egypt and give you. Thank God there are wells even in the wilderness. Wells is with a capital W and a second E, referring to the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Wells. And hunters near the forest, Hunter with a capital H is David Hunter, who at this point in time is moving through the Shenandoah Valley with federal forces in a similar tactic as Sherman's march to the sea in the months that followed. Now let the sanitary fair speak to you, she says to Lincoln, on our behalf. If you don't like to listen to any other fair one, she will tell you, black and white, it makes no difference to her. She nurses and tends to all without respect to party or color. Do you not do this? Do you do the same, old Abe? I will be faithful to the faithful. So we have to kind of parse through the semantics there, how this is written in some places, but it's an extraordinarily clever letter. From what we can see based on context clues, as a formerly enslaved woman saying, don't forget about us As you're talking about coming out of this war and into peace, don't forget what that peace could potentially bring to us, and let this sanitary fair speak to you. From June 7th to the 28th, 1864, Philadelphia is going to be completely overcome by this sanitary fair. It's the largest art exhibition in North American history up to that time. It inspired a lot of the post-war art museums right up until today, as far as its designs. It's using many designs for the very first time. Patriotism, innovation, industrialism are major themes. There's a lot of food, there's horticulture displays, a lot of public performances, military artifacts from all around the world, a massive collection of George Washington artifacts, including the original painting of Washington crossing the Delaware. The original was placed on display. There were 16 temporary buildings constructed that were taken down after this concluded. And then the big piece was this big building here, was a 200,000 foot complex that took 40 days to build for this 21-day festival. And we can see that there are a lot of images that come out of it, both drawings as well as photographs. This is General Washington. You see the top here, General Washington's carriage. Here's a press token machine. Here's just looking down one of the main halls. This is a dining hall with a black serving staff. This is a group of Native Americans. However, I should note that Rich Condon with the National Park Service runs Civil of Pittsburgh. I'm sure some of you are familiar with him, good friend of mine. He had discovered that at the Pittsburgh Sanitary Fair that there was an Asian exhibit that was actually white people dressed up as Asians. And so cases like this, we have to wonder, is it really a Native American display? Are these indigenous peoples? And then here's a good overhead map showing streets for those familiar with Philadelphia. You can visit these streets today and see the space where this once occupied. And this will inspire, because of its size, its magnitude, will inspire a lot of souvenirs, ranging all the way from these certificates that come out. There are these medallions that come about as well. And Lincoln will come on June 16th and speak in the main hall. Once again, this is his draft text here, similarly to the Baltimore speech, but not quite the same. It's just not the same speech. He differs from it a little bit. He doesn't pan the city of Philadelphia in this one. He just decides to go in sort of a different direction with his overall tone. And he speaks at a hotel that same day. But ultimately, what he decides to do is focus more upon what's happening with Ulysses S. Grant in the field. You see this shifting away from those hard-hitting topics like liberty and the definition of that word and Fort Pillow. Those sorts of things, they're not really there anymore in this speech that Lincoln gives. It's no less remarkable. It's still, I would argue, sort of a militant version of the Gettysburg Address. But he's focusing much more on the war effort itself rather than on the causes of the war and the consequences that they might bring in its aftermath. War at its best is terrible, he opens. And this war of ours and its magnitude and duration is one of the most terrible. It has deranged business, totally in many localities, and partially in all. It has destroyed property and ruined homes. It has produced a national debt and taxation unprecedented, at least in this country. It has called mourning to almost every home until it can be said that the heavens are hung in black, and yet it continues. And then he goes on to talk about, once more, the Sanitary Commission itself and how much he sees value in it. He talks about its benevolent labors, as well as those of the Christian Commission, have contributed to the comfort and relief of soldiers. He goes on to talk about giving what is due to the soldier who takes his life in his hands and fights the battles of his country. He talks about the fair and tender hand of women. It's many of those same general sort of themes that Lincoln is paying homage to the Sanitary Commission overall. But then he gives, more than any of the other two speeches, a call to action for those who were in the audience. It is a pertinent question often asked in the mind privately and from one to another. When is the war to end? Lincoln asks. Surely I feel as deep an interest in this question as any other, but I do not wish to name a day or a month or a year when it is to end. I have to wonder if that was striking for people to hear, that we're already in this war for 3 going on 4 years. And the president is saying, I don't know what year this will end. Just something small, but you have to wonder how does that come across to someone living through that moment? We know the Civil War continues for another year. They did not know that, of course. I do not wish to run any risk of seeing the time come without our being ready for the end, and for fear of disappointment, because the time had come and not the end. Lincoln believes there's a time when this war is meant to end. We accepted this war for an object, a worthy object, and the war will come when that object is obtained. Under God, I hope it never will until that time. Speaking of the present campaign, General Grant is reported to have said, I'm going through on this line if it takes all summer. And we saw that message a few slides ago. This war has taken 3 years. It was begun or accepted upon the line of restoring national authority and for the American people. As far as my knowledge enables me to speak, I say we are going through on this line if it takes 3 years more. So not only this summer, but if it takes 3 years more, Lincoln says, we're going to continue in this effort. I have never been in the habit of making predictions in regard to the war, but I am almost tempted to make one. If I were to hazard, it is this. He knows where he's speaking. That Grant is this evening with General Meade and General Hancock, both of Pennsylvania, both from the outskirts of Philadelphia, and the brave officers and soldiers with them, in a position from whence they will never be dislodged until Richmond is taken. And I have but one single proposition to put now. If I shall discover that General Grant and the noble officers and men under him can be greatly facilitated in their work by a sudden pouring forth of men and assistants, will you give them to me? And the crowd yells back in the affirmative at Lincoln. They start cheering. And he says, then I say, stand ready, for I am watching for the chance. And so Lincoln's speech here is a bit different than the first two. It's not as social in how he's thinking about this war. It's how do we end this war? How do we prosecute this war to its end under General Grant? So Lincoln says to them, I'm watching for the chance. And that great partnership, as it's oftentimes called, between Grant and Lincoln is going to continue through. They meet each other in the last weeks of Lincoln's life, last weeks of the war on the outskirts of Petersburg at Grant's headquarters at City Point. And fast forward to April 6, 1865, Philip Sheridan writes a famous note to Ulysses S. Grant saying in part, if the thing is pressed, I think that Lee will surrender. And Lincoln says to Grant the following day, if the thing is pressed, I think Lee will surrender. Let the thing be pressed, Lincoln tells him. And so he'll speak to the nation twice more as the war concludes. Once in his second inaugural. Of course, one of the things we have not talked about is why I think in part these speeches are pushed to the background is they're happening right at the beginning of the presidential campaign of 1864. A campaign Lincoln thinks he has absolutely no chance of winning. A series of Union victories will ultimately play a large role in his eventual victory. And his second inaugural, he will deliver on March 4th, 1865, considered by many perhaps his greatest speech. And then on April 11th, 1865, addressing a serenade at the White House, 2 days after the surrender of Robert E. Lee to Ulysses S. Grant. And this will be the occasion when Lincoln lays out a plan for Reconstruction and says, for the first time in American history, that a sitting U.S. president suggests Black voting rights, even on a limited scale, for Black men who have served in U.S. armies and are literate. He suggests that. John Wilkes Booth is in the audience, says that's the last speech Lincoln will ever make. And he makes true on that promise a few days later, of course. Now, Lincoln received one final invitation, and I will close here, before he died. And this was to speak at a U.S. Sanitary fair in Chicago, where the first one had been held, of course, in the state we most associate with Lincoln, where he spent most of his adult life. The invitation comes on March 4th, when he's invited to speak at the Northwestern Sanitary Fair. I'll allow someone who lived through this to narrate. Now, for the most part, we have stuck almost exclusively to writings that are from the period that we're talking about. They're contemporaneous sources. This one's not. It's from 24 years later, in 1889, a woman named Mary Ashton Livermore, who writes a book called My Story of the War. She was part of the Sanitary Commission, and she says that in talking with Lincoln around this time when he was invited, he says, all the time I was in Philadelphia, I was crowded and jostled and pulled about and cheered and serenaded until I was more used up than I ever remember to have been in my life. I don't believe I could stand another big fair, is what he tells her in response to this. But, he adds, I know the people of the Northwest would like to see me, and I want to see them. And if state duties do not absolutely forbid, I will try to make a brief tour west at the time of your fair. News breaks in Chicago Tribune. Lincoln and Mrs. Lincoln are going to attend the Great Fair commencing May 30th, 1865. And that news breaks on April 14th, 1865. Lincoln is shot at Ford's Theater that night, and by 7:22 the following morning, across the street at the Peterson House, he succumbs to that wound. And so that invitation for the people of Chicago will come. Lincoln will visit Chicago, but not in the form that they had hoped or anticipated. In the form instead, as one of his last stops before arriving at Springfield for his ultimate burial. So I'll conclude with Mary Ashton Livermore's reflection on this. She says that after that discussion she had with Lincoln at the White House about coming to the Chicago Fair, she says, once more I did see the president in Chicago, which opened its arms to receive his hallowed remains. Not thus had Chicago hoped to receive the beloved president. A month later, and the great Northwest would have prepared for him a brilliant welcome. Then with great shouts rending the air, with salvos of artillery, with thrilling strains of triumphant music, with songs and ovations from old and young, from children and maidens, with flowers and costly gifts, and with overflowing hearts, it had hoped to testify the most idolatrous love it bore him. But God ordered otherwise, and translated him beyond our poor praises and above our earthly offerings. And so that's the story of how at 3 sanitary fairs in the spring of 1864, Lincoln broke the news of a racial massacre, told the American people that they could not forget about the work that their women were doing alongside soldiers in this war, and ultimately encouraged the American people to continue on until ultimate victory, until ultimately the causes of the war could be brought out and the consequences that would follow. Not only of a nation restored, but of a nation more perfect than it had been when it entered that war 4 years earlier. And of course, as we can see, maybe the missed opportunities that did not come as a result of what happened faithfully this week 160 years ago. Thank you all very much. Certainly take some questions if we have time. And here are a few events that we have coming up at Seminary Ridge Museum. These are our free offerings. Next one's going to be this Friday, so just 2 days from now. 2 lights for tomorrow, part of a nationwide commemoration to honor the events 250 years ago of Paul Revere's and William Dawes's ride. We're going to be taking two candles up to 2 lanterns up to the famous cupola of Schmucker Hall of the museum, with some festivities happening before that. That kicks off at 7 o'clock. And then keep an eye out for, we do these throughout the year, our Fridays on the Ridge programs. Some are at 3:30 in the afternoon, others are at 6:30 in the evening, bringing interesting topics related to the stories that we tell on Seminary Ridge. Any questions from anyone?
Is there you hinted at this, but is there a through line from dates before fairs, the 1876 Philadelphia Exposition?
Yeah, there are a lot of, if you read histories of fairs and expositions, there's one, the author's name is not coming to me, but I think the book is called Bazaars and Fair Ladies, something like that, where we can see in the aftermath of these throughout the 20th century, especially, people are picking up that these fairs, and especially the Philadelphia one, were definitely blueprints for expositions, world fairs, things along those lines that are coming about in the decades that followed. So I think the sanitary fair idea overall inspires things like that, but especially that Philadelphia fair, that was sort of the testing ground for how big can we make these things. And so that becomes something that more recent scholars have picked up on. There's a clear sort of copy and paste at a smaller scale to make it only that much bigger.
2 things. I have heard that Lincoln had donated things like the copies of Emancipation Proclamation to soldier fairs to raise money. And also with his speech at Philadelphia, they've been talking about the drafting this way and recruit people to volunteer for the service.
Yeah. So yeah, we will see that there are, the same thing, believe it or not, at Gettysburg, we think of that as such a revered speech today. But even people within Lincoln's own cabinet, Salmon Chase, people in Congress, Thaddeus Stevens speaks out about Lincoln coming to Gettysburg, and then we'll see the same sorts of things happen when he goes to these sanitary fair speeches. They wonder what ulterior motive is there here for Lincoln. Is this an effort at driving up support for a draft? Is this a political message of his own reelection campaign? And we have to remember, just in our own minds, presidential campaigns are always happening. But at that point in time, June would have been when your conventions are starting to take place. June and August, I believe, are the conventions respectively in 1864. And it's pretty much right up until those conventions start. There's not really much politicking or campaigning in the way as we think about it today. That won't come about really until a lot of people point to James Garfield's campaign a couple of decades later. But there will be these, especially from Democratic newspapers, from conservative op-eds, that there are these charges against Lincoln of, why are you going to speak there? Is it really just to try to benefit the Sanitary Commission, or is it to try to drive up support for drafts, for just enlistments overall? And of course, there's a little bit of that there. I think Lincoln making that call to action, especially at the end of the Philadelphia Fair, and saying, if we need support in the form of materials and manpower, will you provide? That's a clear call to what sort of manpower could we need. Of course, it's going to be in the form of enlisted men. And so, yeah, that there will always be that question there, that sort of attack being made against him, even by people on his own side sometimes. Any questions?
I'm not really sure how to word this, but were these fairs, were they put on by the same people that would go from city to city, or were the cities just creating these themselves?
Great question. It's a little bit of both. So you have your overarching Sanitary Commission leaders who are overseeing, the cohesion as much as possible. Sometimes there's not a lot between different chapters. But then you have within your cities themselves, those are going to be the people who are running sort of the day-to-day. And even sometimes if you have like smaller cities, so Lancaster is a good example, where you have a sanitary fair, the Patriot Daughters putting it on there, some of the things that they are receiving at that fair will go to benefit the Philadelphia Fair. So it's one of these things where you have these dozens or hundreds in some cases of these smaller organizations that are working together, but it's all under the umbrella of the Sanitary Commission. And the fairs are sort of a combination of those more regional or city-based affiliates, all overseen by the same overall committee.
Follow up, how was that funded and to get started? Or the Sanitary funded? And I know the fairs were a fundraiser, but in the early years, how was it funded?
Yep. So they're going to basically try to make this sort of public-private partnership, which is why they try to bring Lincoln into it. Is there any window of federal funding for this to be available? But pretty much as soon as they start selling these items to fundraise for the umbrella organization, it really just sort of starts to feed itself, essentially, pretty much from the beginning. And that's where we're going to see that there are, a lot of accusations made. I know that Pete Mealy's here, and he's done work on Patriot Daughters of Lancaster. And I remember you said that there are accusations even of at the local level, small organization. What are you doing with all of this money? So as soon as this funding starts, when they start to say, hey, we need to raise money for our soldiers. And this starts as far back as in 1861, as I mentioned, it begins. And if you look at some posters, sometimes famous ones. So another project I've done a lot of work on is the slave census map of 1861, based on the census of 1860. At the top center of that map, it says this is sold for the benefit of the sick and wounded soldiers of the U.S. armies. So this is something that people are starting to see everywhere as soon as the war begins, that if you go buy this map, this pamphlet, this diary that someone is selling X number of copies of, that's going to go in to help start up organizations like the Sanitary Commission. And then once they begin, it just starts to sort of feed itself. And the Christian Commission, much the same way.
And I've always wondered if there's a gender thing going on there because, you know, you have this push and pull between these women that are running these organizations, but there's always a force of males that are overseeing it. And I've wondered if this question about where is the money going is directed at the females, that they, you know, the undercurrent there is they can't handle money or it's going somewhere that it shouldn't go. And that you see men stepping in to that role to try to manage the money. So I think looking into that as well, that interplay between male and female in the 19th century is important.
Totally, I absolutely agree. And I should note, Scott had mentioned, I had told him that this is likely going to be my master's thesis. So this is one of those projects where there will be more, that down the road in some form that every time I do this, questions like this come about and it's another place to dig and keep adding to the story. Second. That's a good question. I don't know of any efforts that go directly to that usage. That's a great question. There you go, perfect example, something to explore for next time. That will become pretty much immediately as soon as the war is over, when veterans organizations start coming about at like the regimental level, even before like the Grand Army of the Republic. You have the regimental associations. The very first thing that they're trying to raise money for are survivors of prisoners of war camps. So for soldiers themselves, that's top of mind. If you read a lot of mining and dedication speeches, that's a major theme of theirs, is these are the forgotten figures of the war. During itself, whether the Sanitary Commission or others are trying to funnel money in that direction, I don't know. That's a good question. I'll have to look more into that. Thank you all again.